I think we can all agree that political corruption is a bad thing. And you don't get more black and white in this regard than the case of former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell.
Former Republican Governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell, has now been sentenced to 2 years in prison.
24 months. That is how long Bob McDonnell will spend in jail for corruption charges.
Last year, McDonnell was convicted of accepting gifts from a donor in exchange for political favors. This kind of personal corruption, quid pro quo stuff, is what we're used to seeing on television and in film. Put simply, we don't want those in power, our elected leaders, to take ethical shortcuts, and we shouldn't. But our defenses are fragile if personal corruption is the only kind we recognize and protect ourselves against. Unfortunately, this is exactly the case in the United States. A little over 5 years ago, the Supreme Court, in the landmark decision of Citizens United versus the FEC, took up the argument against structural corruption and what happens when the political system itself is dependent on money from private interests, and found it wanting.
Last week, the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests.
The majority decided that political donations from however large an entity are protected as a form of free speech. But does this misunderstand the way politics actually works? Though there is no explicit promise of legislative favors for campaign donors, politicians remain indebted to their wealthiest benefactors, and this debt weaves its way into policy decisions that consider the needs of private interests over those of the Commonwealth. Now, the key argument against regulating this kind of structural corruption is that it's hard to determine where free speech ends and political corruption begins, and that it may not be the court's place to draw that line.
The premise is freedom of speech. The more speech, the better.
But by only recognizing something for something personal corruption, the courts actually do draw a line and abdicate themselves from the complex interplay of money and politics. Now, I guess most people who accuse American politics of being corrupt do so because they see an essential unfairness in the system, reflected in vast economic inequality that's getting worse, not better, as time goes on. When the power of a political campaign comes down to the size of its coffers, it's easy to see how moneyed interests retain an improper advantage. And when that advantage serves to worsen existing inequalities in the system, such politics are, at least in part, structurally corrupt. Worst of all, structural corruption, more so than personal corruption, perpetuates the idea that individual people don't have a voice in politics, that putting the needs of the Commonwealth first is impossible, and so it's pointless to try. Ironically, this kind of collective action, diminished by the free speech of wealthy special interests, is the only way to protect democracy from the corrupting influences that plague it. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you want to support the Nerdwriter and help me keep making these videos, you can go to patreon.com/nerdwriter and pledge as little as $1. Anything and everything helps. Thank you so much for that. If you have a Patreon reward due, I'm going to be sending those out promptly, so be on the lookout for that. I'm not the first person to talk about structural corruption, but I wanted to do it my way. I am passionate about the topic, and I want to do more about it in the future. I just find it really interesting and really important and vital. So follow me on Tumblr and Twitter, and I will see you next time.